Welcome back to another episode of Bare Bones Physiology, a podcast where we discuss exercise at large in diseased, aged, and healthy populations through recent published scientific literature. My name is Mohammed, and next to me is Andrew. And today, Andrew will lead our discussion centered around the use of cold water immersion as a recovery modality following different types of fatiguing exercises. Before I pass it along, I wanted to emphasize that what we discuss today is in no way associated with our current academic institutions. Our thoughts, opinions, and interpretations are solely our own. So with that, I will now pass it along to Andrew so he can get us started. Andrew, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Mohammed. The topic today is cold water immersion. Sort of holds some relevance and some importance to me. That's certainly my area of research within my master's. So certainly a topic that I'm very passionate about and learning more and more by the day. So, and again, it represents sort of a recovery modality that is very commonly used. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in an ice bath, but could also be within cold showers, right? So anything really accessible to get any sort of whole body or limb specific cooling following exercise. That sort of is what cold water immersion is. Yeah, I think that's an important one as well, because that last point that I mentioned specifically is because, my study and what I'll be looking at for my master's thesis is it's looking at limb specific cooling. So, cold water immersion, it's not just whole body cooling. You have to be in an ice bath. We can also look at the limb specific stuff as well. So yeah, it does hold some significance there. To get us started, I'm going to sort of use a meta-analysis paper that I actually had presented before. So for the visual people on YouTube, we'll be putting up some visual slides so you guys can sort of follow along, because the thing with a lot of these cold water immersion studies is it follows sort of a timeline of recovery, right? And it's one of those things where we want to look at recovery, not just in the immediate, but at specific time points following. And for this sort of paper, I think it would do a disservice if we just sort of verbally spoke about it. I think verbally speaking about it and then also pairing that with the visuals will help as well. So yeah, I sort of turned some of the figures into more significant and visually appealing and more digestible figures. So you don't really have to be a statistician to really sort of know what's going on within the figures. So hopefully that will help. But to get us started, the paper is titled "The Effect of Cold Water Immersion on the Recovery of Physical Performance Revisited, a Systematic Review with Meta-Analysis." So within cold water immersion, it certainly has taken on a life of its own. So it was first adopted to treat some of those musculoskeletal injuries. So whether that's managing inflammation with regard to injury, that is certainly sort of the cryotherapy aspect of cold water immersion. And then that's sort of adopted within athletic settings because you do see some sort of acute inflammation effects following exercise. So I think sort of the thought process behind it was, it certainly is valid and holds some truth to it. Like, okay, if we're treating inflammation chronically due to injury with cold water immersion or any sort of cryotherapy sort of technique, can we do that with athletic settings as well, more of an acute setting? So it does hold some significance there, not only to treat inflammation and muscle damage, but also to potentially reduce muscle soreness and sort of the post-exercise fatigue that you see following exercise. Furthermore, it's also been looked at in sort of settings with regard to exercise performed in extreme heat. And a lot of that has to do with the sort of logical thinking of, if I exercise in heat, my tissue temperature, body temperature, all that's going to increase. So by nature and logically, cold water immersion is going to decrease that. So back to sort of our normal levels, so to speak, or get us closer to normal quicker compared to just normal passive recovery. So that's sort of where cold water immersion is with regard to exercise as a whole. But I think again, as we'll see within this paper and numerous other papers as well, and certainly if you search the literature, I mean, it's pretty evident that there's differences with regard to types of exercise. So things like sprint exercise, endurance exercise, resistance exercise, it's not all the same benefits, right? And I think that's such an important concept that I really want to hammer home today, is the fact that just because you sprint doesn't mean you're going to see the same effects as an endurance exerciser using cold water immersion. So yeah, that's a point that I really want to hammer home here. Um, so a sort of a takeaway sentence that this paper mentioned, and it again, it holds a lot of significance because it is really true. It really is true, especially in athletic populations. And the sentence goes as, cold water immersion has been identified as one of the most popular recovery strategies that athletes adopt during training and competition within team, strength, power, and endurance sport. So the key phrase there being most popular recovery strategy, right? So something that is the most popular, most widely used, you would think that'd be great, but we really don't know that much about cold water immersion. And I think that sort of speaks to the newness, I would say, of cold water immersion with regard to recovery modalities. And the reason why I say, there's still a lot of potential skepticism with regard to cold water immersion is because there's so many different factors and variables at play here. So things like the timing that we perform the cold water immersion post-exercise, the temperature that we're sort of cooling in, how long we're cooling in. As I mentioned before, the environmental temperatures that the exercise were performed in, the recovery timetable, that being, when is my next bout of exercise? Is it in 12 hours? Is it 24 hours? Is it 72 hours? That makes a difference. The performance variables that we want to look at, not only is, for example, if I'm looking at endurance as my sort of exhaustive exercise before the cooling, but post cooling, what if I need to perform strength training, right? So what is the impact of endurance exercise and cooling? What is that impact on subsequent strength? Which I think is important, especially for maybe recreational exercisers and athletes, because they might run one day, think that cooling's good for them because they just ran, but 24 hours later, they're performing strength exercise. So different variables at play. Cold water immersion might impact that a little bit differently. And then finally, the type of exercise, as I mentioned before, that is sort of the key point to this paper and a lot of papers with regard to cold water immersion. So the purpose of this paper was to evaluate the effectiveness of cold water immersion on the recovery of physical performance qualities. So that being endurance, strength, and power, and sort of the associated physiological and perceptual markers, accounting for the influence of environmental conditions, prior exercise modality, and then sort of the temporal recovery profile, so that time span of recovery following cold water immersion and the initial bout. So with regard to some of the outcomes that this paper wanted to look at, we're going to look at a few, but I think the vast majority sort of hold some significance. So the primary being strength, jump, sprint, and endurance performance. So what does that look like following the exhaustive exercise, then following the cooling, then those outcomes? So again, the strength, jump, sprint, endurance, how are those affected? And that's important to look at. And then sort of the secondary outcomes that the paper wanted to look at was the muscle damage and inflammatory markers, any sort of metabolic response, perceptual markers, and then certainly the heart rate, and then the core skin and body temperature, core skin and muscle temperature recordings in those hours following cold water immersion. So certainly some very impactful and important measures to be looked at. And that's why I did like this paper when I sort of went through it. Not only that, certainly looking at the time of recovery as well was an importance within this paper. So they wanted to look at sort of the immediate effects, the intermediate effects, and then sort of those long-term effects. So when I mean sort of those short-term effects, I'm talking less than 1 hour, and then in some cases the 1 to 6 hours. So those hours following the initial bout and cold water immersion. And then sort of those intermediate, looking at maybe a day, and then we stretch out to 2 days, and then sort of those longer term being the 3-4 days following exercise. So certainly a range of time that gives us sort of a recovery profile of what's going on with regard to cold water immersion. So noteworthy within this paper is the included studies, right? Because I think it shows, first, what do we already know about sort of this recovery modality in specific types of exercise? So 68 studies were included, the vast majority being endurance-based as well as resistance-based. Noteworthy and importance for sort of my master's thesis is the fact that sprint exercise was very much underrepresented. So there was only 4 studies involving sprint exercise as the initial fatiguing sort of exercise following cold water immersion, or I guess before cold water immersion. So certainly sprint being very much underrepresented holds some significance and potential caution with regard to what this paper shows. But nonetheless, it's a representation of a form of exercise, which I think is definitely necessary, whether it's a very low representation or if it's represented to the max like endurance was. And then finally, mixed exercise. Mixed exercise gets into a very complicated sort of medium here, because we're talking of a mix of energy systems that goes on. So the classification of endurance, resistance, and sprint, that's very much categorical, where mixed is sort of floats between all of them, right? So it's difficult to sort of look at mixed, but I like that they included mixed, and 8 of the studies included mixed exercise. So including it is quite important. With regard to the total participants included in this sort of meta-analysis, it was 427 participants. Now, a good representation for the males, the majority being all males actually, so 402 males, and only 25 females. So with regard to the generalizability of these results, it certainly favors the males, unfortunately, compared to the females. So certainly some area to be looked at with regard to females. Average immersion temperature of the majority of studies was 12.3 degrees, ranging from just under 9 all the way up to 15 degrees. And then the immersion duration was 12 minutes and 19 seconds, ranging all the way down to 3 minutes and then all the way up to 20 minutes. So certainly a range of time and then a range of temperature as well. So that plays into the protocol and prescription and then effectiveness of cold water immersion. Not only that, but also the comfortability of the participant, because obviously the colder it is, the less comfortable it might be. So that's important to note, right? Some of these studies with regard to practical application probably aren't going to use extreme durations of cold water immersion. They might use something a little bit more tolerable and comfortable to the participants. So just something to be a little noteworthy of. And then with regard to the environmental studies, the vast majority reported environmental conditions that were sort of closer to room temperature and not so much the extreme heat. So 46 of the 68 studies did not report sort of the extreme environmental conditions of extreme heat. And within this paper, they determined extreme heat to be greater than 26 degrees Celsius. So we still see some representation, just not a large subset of data. But I think that's okay as well, because there's certainly some area and some growth there. So again, for the visual people on YouTube, you'll be able to see and walk through these figures as I sort of go through them. So looking at some of those physiological performance variables post cold water immersion, endurance saw an immediate improvement in performance following cold water immersion. And then in those time points of 6 hours and 24 hours, we didn't really see any significant improvement with regard to performance. Now, jump and sprint, I sort of want to group them together because they are predominantly an anaerobic power-based activity in essence. So you can see in the immediate hours following exercise and following cold water immersion, you can actually see some impairments in performance. So some impairments that certainly would influence if, let's say, you had to perform a subsequent bout of exercise in the hours following your recovery, then cold water immersion is showing that it's not really that beneficial. However, when we look at the 24 hours and 96 hours with regard to the jump, we see some improvements. So certainly some of those longer term improvements, but the short term, not so much. And then finally, looking at strength, we don't really see anything going on in the immediate hours following. However, at that 24-hour time point, we do see an improvement in performance. So This one's interesting to me because again, my work is going to be with regard to sprint exercise, and that's sort of the research that I'll be looking at. But with regard to what we see, it's certainly suggesting that the rate of force development matters with regard to cold water immersion. So suggesting that lower tissue temperatures impact your rate of force development. So power exercise, your ability to produce force very fast, right? So that certainly is very important, especially if you are a sprinter, for example, or you're a track athlete that performs some sort of jumping exercise. However, if you're a strength athlete, in the immediate aftermath following cold water immersion, we don't really see anything going on. And actually, at the 24-hour time point, we see some improvements. So you can see sort of the differing and it's sort of juggling of all of these different types and variables at play, and how cold water immersion impacts it sort of in the immediate aftermath as well as sort of the long term. So definitely pretty cool to see that, rate of force development impacted, maximal force development not really impacted. So certainly an interplay there with our tissue temperatures, but pretty interesting to see. Then moving on to our physiological performance post cold water immersion with regard to no extreme heat. So on our sort of on the left-hand side of the screen, we can see the pre-cold water immersion exercise. So this is the performed exercise that happened before the cold water immersion. So we're looking at mixed sprint endurance and resistance. And then at the top is your post cold water immersion performance variable that's being assessed. Okay. You can see with the mixed exercise, it's even across the board. We actually don't see any sort of improvements. We also don't see any sort of impairments to performance. Noteworthy to point out, again, very small subset of data with regard to mixed exercise. Because again, it's very much a confusing sort of mix of everything going on. So again, it floats between all these different types of exercises, but from what we see so far, there's nothing that is sort of impacting performance negatively or even improving. However, when we look at sprint exercise and then assess for strength, we see an improvement, which is, again, pretty interesting to see there as well, especially looking at that the subsequent bout of sprint exercise is impacted. So again, further suggesting that potentially it's the rate of force development that gets impacted, not so much our ability to produce maximal force. So that's sort of, again, those 2 points there sort of further hammer home the initial slide or the initial sort of figure that I had up. So pretty interesting there to see sort of a repeated data set sort of indicating the same sort of result. And then with regard to endurance exercise, then testing for strength, we see an improvement. Other variables we don't. And then with regard to resistance, we see an improvement in sort of the following subsequent bout of sprint exercise. However, nothing with regard to other performance variables. When taking those same types of exercise and applying them within extreme heat conditions, you can see sort of the not available data suggesting that there hasn't really been a lot of data collected because there hasn't been a lot of studies performed with regard to exercise and assessing these variables within heat. But you can see no real change until we get to endurance exercise, cold water immersion, and then assessing for endurance exercise after that. We actually see an improvement in endurance exercise compared to passive recovery. So that being sort of the only improvement there suggests that maybe it should be further looked at as well, especially seeing that sprint exercise was only assessed for subsequent bouts of sprint exercise and not the other variables. So very limited subset of data, but interesting to see nonetheless. Gives us a good sort of foundational base to work from. With regard to significant muscle damage and inflammatory markers, I want to point out that I'm just looking at 4 of them, and these are the 4 that showed significance. Within the study, I believe it was 7 sort of markers that they looked at, 5 for muscle damage, 2 for inflammatory, and then they also assessed for swelling. However, creatine kinase, myoglobin, lactate dehydrogenase, and then TNF alpha were the only ones that showed any sort of significance along these recovery timeframes. So certainly the one that we see on screen, creatine kinase being the most impacted with regard to cold water immersion. And Noteworthy, decreases in these markers are beneficial for exercise. So if we see reductions in muscle damage and reductions in inflammation, that's actually beneficial for us overall with regard to subsequent bout of exercise and our sort of accelerated recovery time frame, I guess is the best way to put it. So certainly with regard to our muscle damage markers, we don't really see anything until the day following. So we don't see anything in the immediate aftermath. It's not until we get to 24 hours that we see creatine kinase be decreased, and then 48 and 72 hours following that as well, we see sort of those favorable outcomes along with lactate dehydrogenase at that 72-hour time point. And then the TNF alpha, indicating inflammation, as I mentioned before, we see a decrease at that 24 hours. So we see sort of those intermediate and sort of longer term benefits with regard to cold water immersion, but nothing in the immediate aftermath. And it's also noteworthy to point out that with regard to lactate dehydrogenase and TNF alpha, on a very limited subset of data, and if I remember correctly, it was based on 1 to 2 studies. So a study or 2 studies nonetheless, but certainly room for more growth there with regard to the data to sort of further validate the results, which is important with regard to this setting, especially if we're beginning to look at the mechanisms involved with regard to muscle damage and inflammation, how cold water immersion can sort of mitigate a lot of those sort of processes from happening and creating that sort of linkage. So noteworthy to point out there as well. With regard to some of the perceptual markers, I'm mainly going to focus on muscle soreness because across the board, you can see favorable outcomes of muscle soreness, not only in the immediate, but also in sort of the 24, 48, and 72 hours, and nothing at that 96-hour time point. And that's because very limited studies looked at that 4th day following exercise. They sort of stopped it at the 2-3 day markers. So we see some of those significant improvements at the 1, 6, 24, 48, 72 hours of muscle soreness. And that's important to note because muscle soreness is sort of I would say the gold standard of what cold water immersion is known for, but it certainly holds true with regard to a lot of these studies that if you ask anybody, cold water immersion reduces muscle soreness. We don't know why that is, but that's sort of the consensus with people that are on the fence that cold water immersion is beneficial. So yeah, there's some suggested pathways involved. A lot of it, one pathway sort of relates back to the creatine kinase and sort of how that is reduced and how that sort of matches with strength as well at that 24-hour time point, suggesting that muscle damage is dampened, right? And then if our strength is improving, that means that our sort of muscle at sort of the cellular level is sort of the damaging has gone away, and we've seen sort of the adaptive response of exercise that sort of increases our strength compared to passive recovery. So that's sort of maybe one mechanism suggesting soreness, but that wouldn't necessarily explain the immediate aftermath, right? Because we don't see anything until the 24 hours in both of those markers. So a pathway, but I don't think it's the pathway that certainly is going to explain the 1 hour and 6 hour time points. The second pathway is targeting neurotrophic pathways, and I don't want to get too mechanistic with it, but essentially what it's looking at here is neurotrophic pathways with regard to specific factors that are upregulated based on receptors that are associated with mechanical damage to exercise. So mechanical damage has to do with eccentric exercise. So you can look at mechanical metabolic, so metabolic being more energy system based, mechanical being more sort of eccentric exercise based sort of model. So this model would explain more the eccentric side as opposed to the metabolic energy demanding side of exercise. So these sort of growth factors are upregulated, as I mentioned, based on these receptors. And again, the mechanical aspect, it sort of increases your sensitivity to pain and your feelings of pain, right? So if cold water immersion is somehow able to target those pathways and dampen the response of those pathways, then our sort of sensitivity to the pain that we see following eccentric exercise would then be reduced. However, we don't know how that would happen. It remains very much uncertain. We can't even create any sort of link. It's just a proposed pathway that might explain what's happening. with regard to mechanisms involved. But again, that's a pathway, as I mentioned, that's only explaining eccentric exercise, right? It's not giving us the whole picture of what's happening with different types of exercise. So um, certainly still a lot of room left to look at with regard to sort of those mechanisms involved. And I'd like to say we scratched the surface, but I don't even know if we're there yet, right? So there's still so much room to further explore there. Um, and then finally, with regard to metabolic markers of the study, they looked at lactate, bicarbonate, and blood pH. We didn't see any sort of change with regard to cold water immersion. Um, and sort of I had this discussion with Mohammed off camera as well, but when we look at these metabolic markers in this study specifically, these metabolic markers might be more prominent in the immediate aftermath of exercise and less prominent later on. Well, this study sort of just grouped all those markers. Doesn't matter when it was measured, as long as it was measured, and they grouped it all together. So that's maybe why we're not really seeing any sort of change, because we could be looking at one study that does it at 24 hours, one study looking at 96 hours. So a range of times where those metabolic markers might not even be present. Not only that, but it's incorporated into many different types of exercise. So including sprint, endurance, whatever sort of form of exercise, those metabolic markers were included. And as we can see, it sort of didn't really do anything with regard to cold water immersion, but it would be interesting to see if any of those markers are present and significantly impacted in the immediate sort of aftermath of cooling. So I'm talking like 1, 2, even 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hour following the protocol, to see if cold water immersion has any sort of impact with that. And then finally, and probably not surprisingly to many people, you don't really have to be a scientist to know this one, but if you jump into something cold, your temperature is going to drop, right? So looking at core temperature, which is your body temperature, muscle temperature, and then skin temperature, it reduced. A lot of this had to do with the proposed theory of redistributing blood back to your sort of central circulation, so you don't have to dissipate heat as much. So a lot of that blood is sort of coming back into your central circulation, decreasing some of the cardiovascular strain that we see with some forms of exercise, and then that would have an effect on our heart rate, so reducing heart rate. But I also asked the question, is a significant drop in heart rate post-exercise beneficial? And the reason why I say that is because when a few weeks ago I read a paper and it was looking at active recovery versus passive recovery. No real relevance to cold water immersion, but seeing that data there with regard to all these drops in temperatures and heart rate, it reminded me of one recovery modality, passive recovery, that saw a lot of those same sort of decreases with regard to the three outcomes being peripheral blood flow, body temperature, and heart rate. So with regard to the study, and again, I'll sort of show the title for you guys as well, and I'll include the reference to that paper if people are interested. But active recovery was actually more, it was better suggested as sort of an optimal recovery strategy, because it didn't rapidly decline our heart rate or our tissue temperature, body temperature, because active recovery involves some sort of submaximal exercise following the actual exercise bout. So it's continuously sort of replenishing our energy stores that were maybe exhausted, and also sort of filtering out, removing any of that metabolic waste. So we're getting a lot of oxygenated blood flow to the working muscles to help clear a lot of those byproducts being bad products that are produced because of exercise. Not only that, but with regard to lower body exercise, active recovery is shown to reduce blood pooling within our legs. So again, keeping that blood flowing through our system. And then within that paper, they further suggested that passive recovery sort of did the opposite, where it was like a significant drop in heart rate, a significant drop in sort of core body temperature, and then sort of a fluctuating effect back up to normal. And they suggested that this sort of fluctuation effect, this rapid decline, and then sort of reverting itself back up a little bit, actually was like suboptimal with regard to optimal recovery. And they said that this suboptimal recovery could potentially lead to overreaching. And to take it a step further, overtraining, I think a lot of us have heard of overtraining, and overtraining is sort of a form of exhaustive exercise performed in a short amount of time where we see sort of a reduction in all these performances. So let's say strength training, our performance within strength training sort of decreases a little bit, or fatigue throughout the day. That's what overtraining is. Can be very much reversed within days, right? Well, overreaching takes it a step further. So the author suggested that passive recovery could lead to overreaching. Now, overreaching, you see a lot of those similar effects, and you see a lot of emotional instability, but these effects really can't be reversed. It takes, if you're lucky, days, more so weeks, and if you're unlucky, very much months to sort of reverse those effects of passive recovery. So I sort of pull up this chart here, sort of categorizing active recovery, passive recovery, cold water immersion, and then peripheral blood flow, body temperature, and heart rate. And we can see that cold water immersion looks awfully similar to passive recovery. However, with regard to some of these other figures that I showed, like cold water immersion showed reductions in muscle soreness in the immediate and then following. We saw that cold water immersion was beneficial compared to passive recovery in different types of exercises, and then looking at different variables. So it certainly does explain the wide variability that we see within cold water immersion and some of these other sort of I hate to say passive recovery is something that is less optimal or suboptimal, but certainly something that coming from sort of a strength and conditioning coach myself, I would not recommend passive recovery as a proper recovery modality. I would suggest whether it is active recovery or some sort of recovery strategy other than just sitting in your car and going home and doing nothing, right? So we see similarities there, but I think it speaks again. It goes back to sort of the variance that we see within cold water immersion, the prescriptions, the protocols. It's also different. And I think different protocols and prescriptions can affect sort of the results that you see in your subsequent bouts of exercise. And it also speaks to the fact that although we might know something about cold water immersion, I don't think we really know that much about cold water immersion just yet. And as I mentioned before, with regard to the metabolic stuff and the pathway stuff and like the mechanistic pathways, we might not even have scratched the surface of it yet. So I think we still have yet to really uncover anything of great significance, but we're certainly headed in the right direction. But yeah, certainly I took a lot of time there, but something I'm very passionate about myself. So it certainly speaks to the fact and the importance of cold water immersion. If it is the most commonly used recovery modality, but we really don't know that much about it just yet, I think it speaks to the importance of further studying, especially in athletic settings. So yeah.
Totally. I think, I mean, Andrew, this was a really comprehensive discussion into this topic. I think that really what makes this very unique, what makes this discussion very unique is the fact that, like, again, it chose a paper, a meta-analysis that really showed us the magnitude of this topic. And I think that it also shows us the variability that exists when it comes to this topic. I think that it is a very important topic for us to make sure that we research further on and also try and understand more about. And I think that what we're going to be doing for the remainder of this episode is to try and show perhaps where the literature is heading right now. And since that paper was published, although that meta-analysis has been published recently, but I think that it is also important that we realize some of the nuances that exist and show really what's happening there. So the first paper that I will be discussing myself is titled "The Effects of Massage and Cold Water Immersion After an Exhaustive Run on Running Economy and Biomechanics, a Randomized Control Trial." So what this paper does is that it takes 48 well-trained male athletes and then exposes them to 3 different conditions. So one condition is massage therapy that is done by a certified massage therapist, as the study mentions. 16 participants or 16 subjects were placed in a condition of cold water immersion, and that's, of course, 10 minutes and 10 degrees Celsius which is, I think, as Andrew knows, and sort of as the literature highlights, is particularly done classically 10 minutes, 10 degrees. So that's sort of like more the classic way of doing cold water immersion when it comes to sort of real life settings, as well as the literature out there. And then the last condition being passive recovery. And of course, it's not a crossover design. So we have 16 that are exposed to certain conditions, 16 that are exposed to a certain condition, and then 16 that are exposed to the other condition. So what this study aimed to do was that it aimed to identify the differences in terms of the impacts of these recovery modalities based on two parameters. So one parameter is running economy, and running economy is identified as looking at the VO2 level of the athletes as they're undergoing the treadmill test or the physical activity, and then sort of correlating that and looking at running velocity. So looking at the level of VO2 that the person reaches, along with their running velocity, and trying to look at both of these factors together to try and produce a value being running economy. And then the other factor that they looked at is sort of biomechanical measurements. And two of interest, although they did look at more, but two of interest that they highlighted are stride length and stride angle. And because the study is one that had a physical activity type of running, that's why they measured stride length and stride angle as two factors. So I will begin by highlighting a little bit of the physical activity protocol that they underwent. I think that really the unique thing about this study is the fact that the physical activity protocol is one that is very organized, and it is one that happened over stages. And I think that it's very neat the way that they did it. So the first thing that they did is that they had all participants undergo a training session. So that training session is one that involved a warm-up. And that warm-up was divided into two parts. So 15 minutes of self-paced jogging or slow running. And then after that, it was 5 minutes of supervised physical activity under, of course, the supervision of those investigators. But then after that, they took them into a stage where they had them do 10 times 500-meter runs. And during these 500-meter runs, the goal was to get the subjects up to 90% of their maximum heart rate. That's pretty high intensity, right? So that's a training session. But in that training session, there was no measurement of any parameters. It was mostly just to kind of get the participants into the zone almost. And then 24 hours after that training session is when the actual data collection started. So they had the first treadmill test, and then that first treadmill test is one that involved the participants undergoing 3 stages or 3 sort of incremental speed runs that were pre-classified. So there were 12 kilometers an hour, 14 kilometers an hour, and 16 kilometers an hour on the treadmill. And of course, they were looking at all these factors, including VO2 level, including, for example, biomechanical analyses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then after that, they also, after that treadmill test, what they did is that 1 hour after the treadmill test, they then had the intervention, or lack thereof, in the case of the passive recovery. So they had the massage. The massage was applied by, again, a certified massage therapist, or cold water immersion, 10 minutes and 10 degrees Celsius. And then after that, they got them back. The following day, and then they had them do, or 48 hours rather, and then they had them do the treadmill test. This treadmill test was exactly the same, but they then looked at the parameters after that recovery modality that happened 1 hour after the first treadmill test and compared that between the first and the second days. And the results of this, I think, are very, very interesting. And I think that it really speaks to some of the things that Andrew spoke about in that meta-analysis. But I think that it also makes us question sort of the efficacy of cold water immersion in comparison with other modalities. So one of the things that it did is that it found that massage therapy was actually significantly better than both cold water immersion and passive recovery. And they found no significant difference between cold water immersion and passive recovery when it came to running economy and when it came to biomechanical measures. But they did find that when it came to massage therapy. So I think that that's really something that's interesting to look at, because again, I think that it really makes us think about, okay, is it really worth it for us to do things like, for example, cold water immersion, when we could consider other recovery modalities that could be potentially more beneficial than that? And maybe I think it also makes us like think about like resources that are put into these recovery modalities, things of that sort. These are all questions that come to mind, but I think we're going to touch on that later on in our discussion. But it is really important that we kind of think about that, and I think that this paper does a really good job of doing so.
Yeah, no, I think that's great because I think we're looking at cold water immersion, especially in that study, cold water immersion versus passive recovery, but adding in a different sort of exercise sort of recovery modality. And then looking at massage specifically, like, we see some of the improvements, as you mentioned, with regard to massage. Well, that brings into the forefront of foam rolling, right? Like something that you can do, it's accessible at home. And it's I consider foam rolling like a cheap form of a massage, right? So something you can do wherever you want. So interesting study, especially when you begin to sort of compare cold water immersion with all these different types of recovery strategies. So moving on now, looking at sort of my last paper, something I'm going to run through very quickly because I think sort of the impact of the study holds a little bit more significance than maybe some of the outcomes that they wanted to look at. And certainly they looked at overall well-being as well, but I'm just going to look at maybe the performance aspect of this study specifically. So shorten it up just a little bit. So it's titled The Utilization of Performance Markers to Establish the Effectiveness of Cold Water Immersion as a Recovery Modality in Elite Football. And the aim of the study was to explore the effects of cold water immersion post-fatiguing exercise on multiple performance parameters in elite footballers compared to passive recovery during mid-competitive seasons. So we're talking elite athletes here, and their sort of definition for elite athletes was competing at the national or international level. So certainly we're talking about the elite of the elite. And I think this is important to look at because this is another subset of populations that maybe have maximized their performance capabilities to get to where they are. So seeing if cold water immersion has any sort of maybe a little bit of a benefit is going to be interesting for them. The exercise was performed at room temperature, so 21 degrees Celsius, and sort of the objective measures that they wanted to look at was eccentric hamstring strength, isometric adductor strength, skin surface temperature, hamstring flexibility, and as I mentioned, the perception of well-being. I'm going to stay more on sort of the strength and flexibility part with regard to this study, because I think it holds some relevance as a performance sort of objective measure that we certainly need to look at. And certainly the psychological side of cold water immersion is another aspect, and it opens up sort of a whole nother discussion that we can sort of do a 24-hour live stream on. Like that's how extensive it can get, right? So we'll keep it to the performance aspects of this. So baseline data was collected prior to the match, so pre-training, immediately following, and then they looked at some of those intermediate time points, but specifically the 24-hour time points. So looking at the two groups, they were randomly assigned. So group one was the cold water immersion group, and it was 11 minutes of exposure to cold water immersion in 10 degrees Celsius of water. So very, as you mentioned, Mohammed, very common within the literature to use something around the 10-minute, 10 degrees marker for whatever reason. And then this study, importantly and noteworthy, looked at whole body cooling up to the sternum level. So not just looking at the leg with respect to some of their objective measures was just solely in the leg. So it's pretty cool to see them apply that in sort of an ice bath bucket setting. And then group two, it was just the same length of time, just no cold water immersion, just sort of sitting and resting there. And yeah, just jumping into the results real quick, was actually quite interesting because, we saw some improvements in hamstring strength, but nothing, and that's eccentric hamstring strength, but nothing with regard to isometric adductor strength, and then nothing with regard to hamstring flexibility, right? So we're seeing sort of strength improve, adductor strength not improve, certainly different types of contractions there, and then hamstring flexibility not improve, but we see the eccentric strength improve, which is a form of lengthening, right? So it's a lengthening, but we don't see anything in the hamstring flexibility. So I found that's quite interesting. not only for that, sort of those results, but also the fact that we're beginning to look at some of these measures that we can look at. Like the first study that I looked at a lot of some of these sort of metabolic markers that we see in some of these markers of muscle damage and inflammation. You can't do that in a practical setting. We're not going to be drawing blood out of our participants to see if we've recovered better than someone else. But certainly seeing it with regard to strength, especially in soccer as well. The eccentric hamstring strength, I think, is very much important, especially with regard to sprint exercise, because sort of sprinting for a free ball, for example, because you do see sort of rapid lengthening of the hamstring muscle. And certainly if you're stronger compared to weaker, you might see reduced hamstring injuries. So that's sort of the relevance of this study that I saw. And yeah, I thought this was sort of a good starting point for hopefully other sports and sort of research to look at different aspects, because again, we're looking at soccer and it's predominantly aerobic, but we're starting to see maybe a mix of some of those anaerobic spurts with regard to it. So it's cool to see some of these studies look at different measures. So yeah.
Yeah, totally. And I think again, like the fact that these studies are quite extensive in terms of like, looking at all these factors and trying to compare them together, I think speaks to the fact that this topic is one that is getting the interest of many people involved in the field of exercise physiology, just because of the fact that it's becoming a more prominent recovery modality. And as you mentioned, I mean, it is the most common recovery modality within the population of elite athletes right now. So it's quite a nice topic for us to explore and continue exploring. So the fourth paper rather, that we're talking about and highlighting here today is the evaluation of passive recovery cold water immersion and contrast baths for recovery as measured by game performances markers between two simulated games of rugby union. So what this study is doing is that it had 24 male athletes, well-trained athletes, of course, rugby players. And what it did is that it tried to compare three things. So it tried to compare passive recovery again, which is doing nothing, and then tried to compare cold water immersion as well with contrast treatment. And what they mean by contrast treatment here is taking athletes, putting them in cold water, and then taking them and putting them in warm water. And that's about it. So cold water, warm water, right? And what they did and what they tried to sort of look at here is their performance. I mean, they looked at so many different performance markers, but I think that for the sake of our time and just to make sure that everyone is sort of on the same board in terms of understanding this topic, we're going to be highlighting whether they talked about performance improving or not improving. So the divide of this, or rather the details of how these treatment modalities or recovery modalities were used, is that with cold water immersion, they ran them through 2 times of 5 minutes in 10 degrees Celsius water, right? So taking them, putting them in cold water for 2 times 5 minutes. And then in terms of contrast treatment, they ran them through 5 cycles of 10 degrees, 38 degrees water immersion, or hydrotherapy as they call it, right? So you put in 5 cycles of putting them in 10 degrees water, 38 degrees water, right after each other. And then after that, of course, for passive recovery was just 15 minutes of sitting in what they call normothermic conditions. So that is just room temperature. So you just sit down, do nothing for 15 minutes. So basically what this study looks at, or what they conclude at the end, is that there is improved recovery in both the cold water immersion and the contrast treatment condition, in comparison, of course, with passive recovery. And I think that this is very, again, peculiar, because it really shows us some of the sort of intricacies that go into understanding this, because now we're not talking only about sort of cold water, we're talking about contrast. And that is something that actually some athletes have applied in the past. And I think that Andrew, can kind of maybe highlight to us a little bit about, some of the ways that was done in the past. But I do know of some athletes, for example, like professional athletes, that actually speak of all the glories of doing contrast therapy in comparison with cold water, which is, again, something that makes you think about, well, Is it cold water specifically, or is it just the shock that the body is exposed to, or what is it exactly? But again, this paper just says that there is improved performance. So that's something to keep in mind. But I think this really makes me think about some of the questions here of the practicality of using cold water. And I think that this will bring us into this discussion topic in particular, which is that should coaches, let's say, for example, in professional teams or what have you, should they be integrating cold water into the recovery of their athletes, especially considering and Andrew, you highlighted this huge variability that we have in these papers, and especially when it comes to the timing, especially when it comes to, for example, the paper where I talked about specific like how massages seem to work even better than cold water. Is it actually practical for coaches to be investing time and money into cold water immersion when the variability seems so high and the effectiveness of it compared to other recovery modalities seems to be questionable?
Yeah, it's a sort of an intricate question to look at because your papers, and I liked your papers because my third paper that I looked at, and especially the first one actually, it was just looking at cold water immersion versus passive recovery, whereas your papers actually included different sort of forms of recovery that could also be used. So contrast and then also massage. Suggests that there's so many out there. That's why I don't think we can solely sort of rely on cold water immersion as the immediate sort of go-to recovery modality for athletes, especially looking at it from the standpoint that in professional sports, and I'll speak to professional sports, sort of the four major ones like hockey, baseball, football, like those sports are a mix of these systems, right? That the interplay and intertwine of some of these energy systems that, we don't fully know what happens in sprint exercise, so anaerobic exercise, but basketball includes some of the anaerobic exercise. So I think it would almost be with regard to implementation and the practicality as a strength and conditioning coach or an athletic therapist or any sort of form of not only rehabilitation but also recovery. It would almost be a bad practice to advocate for it, especially knowing that it's not, although it is cheap, you just throw ice and cold water in a tub and then you tell your athlete to go in there. We don't really know what's going on. I think with regard to recovery, I mean, active recovery has been around for so long. It's sort of from where I come from and what I sort of advocated for my athletes when I worked with them, it was active recovery. It was do something submaximal, get some of those aerobic oxygenated benefits going on within your working muscles, clear some of those metabolic byproducts to some of those waste products. Spend 5-10 minutes doing that, and then we'll send you on your way, as opposed to just doing absolutely nothing. The cold tub gets a little bit more tricky, because again, it's so new, and and as you mentioned, like we don't really know to what extent it is. We don't even know the mechanisms, and I think that's why it's bad practice to apply it because again, we don't know the relation to some of these mechanisms that reduce soreness or reduce muscle damage or inflammation or anything like that. So all we really have to go off of right now with it is a lot of the perceived notions that it gives athletes. And then that also brings up another question of like, and like with regard to if I'm speaking to an athlete, like if it's improving your performance to what you feel like it is. So if I ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, do you feel like you're better today than if you didn't do it? And they say, yes, I win. Like I feel 10 out of 10 better, after the cold tub. Then it gets into the question of like, is that going to help them? You know what I mean? Like just sort of their psychological feeling going to help them, and certainly brings upon the question of the placebo effect of cold water immersion and whether the impact of the placebo effect, if it is present. I mean, it's a very tricky question because again, it's very new, right? With regard to cold water immersion and everything that sort of happens. And as you said, it's just like the immediate shock of the body and you're like, oh my God, I feel so much better. But in reality, it's actually doing absolutely nothing, or it's actually hurting performance. But I guess maybe could you speak on some of maybe the impact of the placebo effect with
Yeah.
regard to this?
Yeah, I think like the peculiar thing to me, and I think to our listeners who are a little bit more involved with exercise and exercise physiology, and I think with the both of us and some of the people that we speak with, I think that a common theme within exercise physiology is just a difficulty of placebo, of adding a placebo treatment. Because some of these treatments are just like to your face. Like, for example, you're either in a tub with ice and water or you're not,
It's a tough one to blind
right?
there, right?
Uh, it's a tough one to blind, right? Like, it's a tough one.
Yeah,
It's like, okay, you're either in this or you're not in this. You know what I mean?
yeah.
So, in a way, it's just what it is, right? But I think that it is also a part of our understanding nonetheless. Because if the athlete feels better and then all of a sudden they start performing better as a result of feeling better, then maybe a coach will be like, you know what? They just feel better. They can just perform better, whatever it is. But I think
Yeah.
if we're speaking to the science, to sort of the performance parameters, I think that that's really what matters at the end of the day. Because again, through that meta analysis that you spoke about at the start, the rate of perceived exertion, or sort of the feeling of being tired that athletes have based on the studies highlighted there, it seems to be something that is improved with cold water immersion. But then
Mhm.
when we look at the specifics like force production, strength, the time, for example, that cold water is applied, et cetera, these are all things that are very variable. Sometimes it's detriment, right? It's detrimental to the performance of the muscle. Sometimes it improves it. Very variable, very conflicting. So yes, maybe athletes might feel better. And yes, that might be as a result of the placebo effect. But I think if we're really trying to get something that will be practical and at the same time align with the science and aligns with what we understand about exercise physiology, and really make sure that we're giving athletes something that will actually improve their performance, then maybe cold water immersion is not the greatest. But I do see why the placebo effect is very huge, because again, it's very difficult to blind at subjects to whether or not they're put in an ice bath.
Yeah.
And it's also very difficult for us to try and differentiate between, well, if they feel better, then they're going to perform better. But are they actually performing better? That's the question that I think remains with
Yeah, and
us.
I think
So
we definitely come at it from a researcher perspective where like we want to know like what's it doing? Like what is cold water
yeah,
immersion doing that is influencing improvements or not? And I think, tie it all back to sort of rounding in form and sort of full circle here, like there certainly is two parts to this, right? There's the researcher side that wants to know like what is happening, what is the mechanism involved, and then there's the coach and athlete side of things where it's just like the coach would be like to the athlete, how do you feel today? Do you feel better? Do you feel refreshed? And if the athlete goes, yeah, I feel so much better, hopping out of the cold tub yesterday, then the coach is probably going to be like, well, I want the athlete to have that mentality as opposed to like, I feel sluggish, I feel tired, I feel fatigued. Even if there is no physiological difference, but if there's sort of an emotional and psychological difference, and its benefits and favors cold water immersion, then the coach might be like, well, I don't really care about the mechanisms. I just know my athlete's ready to go today. Right. And I think
yep.
the coach is going to be like, I want that. So let's get 50 cold tubs in a recovery room. Right. Like,
50
that's
cold tubs, everyone lined up.
yeah. So just ice lined up, ice machines everywhere. But that sort of speaks to the two sides of this. And that
Yeah.
maybe speaks to why it is so popular, is because, you know, I like to look at a lot of strength and conditioning facilities, and you see sort of a lot of these professional sports and even collegiate sports sort of adopting these recovery rooms that have designated cold tubs, right? But as
Mhm.
researchers looking at it, we don't know what the mechanism is. Like we don't know whether it's just like as you mentioned, a placebo effect, or if there actually is something that's going on that's deeper rooted that needs to be looked at and identified. But I mean, it's popular. We know it's popular. I'd be lying if I said that I haven't done 5 minutes in a cold shower before, right? So like, I think we've
Yeah.
all sort of tried, whether it doesn't have to be necessarily a cold tub, but turning the shower temperature water all the way down to cold and just seeing what it feels like. It's a shock to the body. But I think we've all sort of been there. So yeah, it's an interesting topic, something I'm passionate about, and again, something I could talk for hours about. But only a short amount of time. So, so yeah. Anything else to add, or are you all?
No, I think yeah, I think this was quite comprehensive. I think we really covered a lot when it comes to cold water immersion, and it's really an interesting topic. It's really something that I think needs a lot of research
Yeah.
still. There are a lot of questions to be answered. There's a lot of things to be explored. But I think that nonetheless, the research that exists right now sets the basis for
Yeah.
these questions that will be produced in the future, and maybe trying to do better than what previous research articles or research projects have done when it comes to answering some of these burning questions that exist with cold water immersion.
Yes,
So
and like you
yeah,
mentioned, I think it sets the foundation for future work, and I'm happy to be a small little sliver of that future work. So I'm interested to
100%.
see what sort of happens in the future. But with that, we thank you guys for listening and watching to our fourth episode of Bare Bones Physiology. We're sort of getting up and at it now, so we're getting to the hang of things. Next episode in 2 weeks' time will be led by Muhammad, so looking forward to that. And yeah, thank you all for joining. Take care.
Thank you all.